Подведем итоги сегодняшнего дня.
TVRain, Дождь, the only Russia's independent network.
We are not allowed to work in our country anymore.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to you.
It's a real war.
Maybe there are some negotiations about that.
There will be very serious consequences.
TVRain Newsroom presents Russia Tomorrow.
President Putin has announced mobilization in Russia. Officially, it is being called a partial mobilization, but this is just an afterthought. The Russian authorities are preparing to call as many as 300,000 people to participate in the war in Ukraine. At the same time, in the coming days, the Russian authorities will hold so-called referendums on the inclusion of the occupied territories of Ukraine into Russia. In the view of failure on the front in Ukraine, the Kremlin is raising the stakes. My name is Tikhon Zitko, and this is Russia Tomorrow from TVRain, the last remaining independent Russian news channel. Here we continue to tell the truth about Russia, the truth that Vladimir Putin is trying to hide. And in today's program, the mobilization of Russians to participate in the war with Ukraine, will it bail the Kremlin out after setbacks at the front? How will the referendums on the inclusion of the occupied territories of Ukraine into Russia impact the situation? And do Russians want to go to war? What do Russians really think about Putin's war in Ukraine? The moment of truth has arrived for the Russian war in Ukraine. President Vladimir Putin has raised the stakes to higher than ever. A week ago, we covered the defeat that Putin suffered in the Kharkiv territory. Ukrainian forces launched a counteroffensive and drove the Russian army out of the region. And here is Putin's response. He has decided to try and win back the ground lost with fresh manpower and announced mobilization.
In this situation, I consider it necessary to make the following decision. It is completely equal to the threat that we are facing, namely to protect our homeland, its sovereignty and territorial integrity, and to ensure the security of our people and people in the liberated territories. I consider it necessary to support the proposal of the Ministry of Defense and military leaders to undertake partial mobilization in the Russian Federation.
Ukraine for Putin is a matter of principle. It has long been known that he does not consider it a separate state and sees it only as part of Russia. And in order to achieve this aim, he is not ready to stop at any obstacle. Not the destruction of Ukrainian cities, not the civilian victims in Ukraine, and not the death of soldiers, including the deaths of Russian troops.
300 тысяч резервистов, которые будут призваны.
There will be 300,000 reserves called up. We have immense mobilization resources, meaning those who are not serving but have combat and military experience. They total almost 25 million of us. So you can see that the mobilization is just 1% of that, or just a little more.
This is Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. It must be said right away that his words cannot be taken at face value. The Russian authorities carefully conceal any information about losses in the Russian army. But even from their open sources, it is evident that at least 500 more have been killed. In reality, the number is far greater. According to Ukrainian military intel, for example, 55,000 people were killed. Putin wants to solve it with the help of mobilization, but will force recruitment help. Over the past 6 months, the Russian army has shown itself to be unprepared, undisciplined, unmotivated, and equipped with outdated technology. Christo Grozev, investigator from Bellingcat, is joining us now. So, Christo, thank you so much for joining us. The main question today is about draft announced by Vladimir Putin. How big is this game changer, and is it a game changer at all?
What is certain is that it is not a game changer in the near couple of months. In the short term, these people will not be able to influence the counteroffensive that we see from Ukraine. So let's talk about how much of a game changer it can be in a few months, in 4 to 5 months. I think the number of people that can be potentially recruited, even after all of the attrition of deserters, people who actually are taking flights to leave the country right now, the quality of the people that will end up at the front line does not allow them to be a game changer. Why is that? At this point, Russia has had already several months of very expensive and heavy hidden recruitment, hidden mobilization through outsourcing this effort to private companies. Prigozhin comes to mind with very, very high salary offers. And anybody who actually had the desire to take part in this war and the specialization to be of importance already signed up for one of the 4 different private companies that offer increasingly high salaries. So the people that will join from now on are people that are not qualified. They're just bodies that will be used as perishable commodity. And these people cannot really make a difference on the front line.
As long as I understand, the other problem is that there is a huge problem with the Russian war vehicles, with the tanks and with the artillery. Is there a way for the Russian authorities to find the solution here?
Well, I mean, they can just pace themselves. That's about the only thing that they can do, because within the next 3 to 4 months, the current rate of attrition of the equipment will mean that the only weapons that these new recruits, these new mobilized hundreds of thousands of people will have are Kalashnikovs. That's about the only thing that Russia has in sufficient quantities. But to produce new tanks, to produce new artillery units, almost 8 to 9 months are needed. So I don't see really, I see a big gap between the number of people that Russia can round up and the equipment, the military equipment that is not available.
Having said that, what is your point of view of the future of this war? If everything is so bad for the Russian government, this step looks like a desperate step.
Well, the fact that everything looks bad for the Russian government does not necessarily equate to everything looking good for the Ukrainians. At this point, I don't see any winning strategy for the Kremlin. There's the only winnable part of this war is delaying and turning it into a war of attrition without a definite outcome. And here, the Kremlin is putting its bets on the fact that it can last longer by having a slow war of attrition than Ukraine, because Ukraine largely depends on foreign aid, both military and humanitarian at this point. And Putin clearly is counting on the West giving up on Ukraine after losing interest. So I think the real outcome of the war depends on how much Ukraine can mobilize the West and the rest of the world in continuing the support. And this will be driven largely also by successes in the short term, because the more successful Ukraine is in the counteroffensive, the more enthusiastic the West becomes in giving Ukraine more weapons.
One last question about, speaking of hidden mobilization, we saw last weeks how Russia and Yevgeny Prigozhin, a businessman close to Vladimir Putin, how he was recruiting Russian prisoners in Russian camps to take part in a Russian invasion into Ukraine. How big this process is and how effective these people are on the battleground?
Well, first, one thing I would like to look at is whether this search of, let's call it scraping the bottom, people looking for the last remaining 4,000, 5,000 people that can be found in jails, in prisons, it indicated that the decision to mobilize was not made yet in the last couple of months. So it must be a last-minute decision, because otherwise that effort was meaningless. And why is it meaningless? Because these people are not efficient fighters. These people are antisocial, most of them. They end up in jail because they can't fit in society. And now suddenly it is expected of them to fit in the most structured of societies, an army. Many of them will defect immediately. Many of them have a grudge against the Russian government and will possibly join or offer to join the Ukrainian armed forces against Russia. It's a totally wild card of a group of people, which just showed the desperation, at least in the last month, of running out of people.
All right, thank you so much, Christo Grozev, here on TVRain.
Russia tomorrow.
Vladimir Putin's address, in which he announced the mobilization, touched upon another relevant recent topic, the so-called referendums in the occupied territories of Ukraine. They will be held in the coming days, and it seems obvious that as a result, these territories will be annexed by Russia.
Мы не можем, не имеем никакого морального права.
We do not have the moral right to hand over the people close to us to be slaughtered by executioners. We cannot help but respond to their sincere desire to determine their own fate. The parliaments of the People's Republic of Donbass, as well as the military-civilian administrations of the Kherson and Zaporozhye regions, have decided to hold referendums on the future of these territories and have turned to us, Russia, with a request to support such a step. Let me emphasize that we'll do everything to ensure safe conditions for holding referendums so that people of those regions can express their will. And we will support their decision about the future, which will be made by the majority of residents of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics and the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions.
But does this change anything? In the Kremlin, they believe that it does. Moscow threatens to react differently, more ruthlessly, to Ukraine's attempts to regain its territories. But how much more ruthless can they be? Tens of thousands of civilians have already become victims of this war. However, for Kiev and the West, which supports Ukraine financially and with weapons, this changes nothing at all. We will act step by step according to our plans. I am sure that we will liberate our territory. That's what President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, said.
Well, how can you properly assess a completely pointless operation? Look, there's a war going on, a full-fledged war. There are occupied territories full of armed personnel where active hostilities are taking place. So what kind of legal or political procedures could possibly take place that are legitimate and recognized by anyone? It goes without saying that we consider this a completely insignificant action with no legal authority and no value whatsoever. International law clearly defines these territories as the territories of Ukraine, so how is it possible to go to war on someone else's territory, the territory of a sovereign state, install a temporary occupied administration, then say that you will urgently hold a referendum that the world should recognize and make these territories recognized as part of the Russian Federation that way? It doesn't mean anything. I'd like to highlight three components here. Firstly, we consider these territories, including the territories of Crimea and Donbass, as exclusively belonging to Ukraine. Secondly, our plan of liberation continues. The counteroffensive hasn't stopped. And thirdly, we fully understand that Russia will find any possible method to somehow stop this counteroffensive and the reclaiming of territory, because they simply currently aren't able to do it with their available military units.
The Kremlin has raised the stakes and is going to throw tens of thousands into the heat of war. But are they ready for it? A week ago on our program, sociologist Grigory Yudin said that only an aggressive minority supports the war in Ukraine. About a quarter of Russians oppose it, but the majority of the population is passive and has preferred to leave, turning a blind eye to the atrocity. With this decision, Putin has brought the war into everyone's home, and the Russians are not happy about it. According to ticketing services, the demand to leave the country has grown tenfold. We're joined by sociologist Denis Volkov from the Levada Center. Denis, first of all, thank you so much for joining me here. I have a couple of questions. First of all, I understand that it is difficult or maybe impossible to predict, but still, what kind of reaction do you think Putin's announcement of mobilization will provoke among Russian citizens?
Honestly, we don't know. We will know quite soon. But I think we can try to compare it with some other not popular decisions that Putin made during his presidency. I think maybe pension reform, maybe COVID quarantine. Oh, sorry to make such a comparisons, but still. Yet those decisions were made in a different context. Well, rather low ratings, not very high support of the government. Now we have very different circumstances because we saw the rally behind the flag effect. We also see that during these 6 months, people are get used to what is happening. And what we see that many people in Russia don't want to follow the news. As they say, I don't follow news. I do not discuss politics. I don't want to know what is happening. So in this sense, people are in the new normality, if I can say so. And this will help to dampen the first blow of, I'm sure, not a very popular decision.
But if this decision is not popular, of course we understand that there is a huge number of people in Russia who are saying that I'm not in politics, this is not about me, this is a war somewhere far from me, I don't know anything about it, I don't want to know anything about it. But now, with this decision of mobilization, these people, they will have to know about it because they could be recruited, or their friends could be recruited, or their I don't know, relatives could be recruited. And I think that the majority of them would not be happy with this fact.
Well, sure. We saw that the support that we are having is not active support, and it rests on the people who are not ready to get involved in, well, almost anything that Russian authorities thinking of. Yet, of course, now some part of the society will be involved, but still it is a partial mobilization. And I think what we will see now that not everyone will be affected by it, and probably people will be trying to avoid serving in the army. But again, we expect different attitudes towards it in, for example, biggest cities, where already we have big portions of society who are not supporting this fighting. And also we see that exactly in the biggest cities, so already some people even now are getting out in the streets, younger people who, well, don't want to go to war. And probably, but in smaller areas, we already saw that more people from there are ready to take part in the military service, and they're already fighting in Ukraine. And there are different attitudes in well, highly developed areas when it is seen as a waste of time, waste of life, and in rural areas where it can be seen as a chance to get out of this misery and do something with your life. So I think this will remain, these different attitudes.
My last question, if we look back in March or back in February 24th, we perfectly remember that it was announced as a special military operation, meaning that it will not last long and it will not take a lot of time to, I don't know, to get Ukraine or to finish this special military operation. Now, 6 months later, we see that it is not as small, it is not as easy as it was announced by the government. Do these 6 months, do this information about terrible situation there, about deaths among civilians and Russian soldiers and Ukrainian soldiers, do these 6 months change anything in attitude of people? Do this change the does this change the level of support?
Actually, the level of support didn't change much. Of course, we must understand that there are different layers of support. When we're talking of 75% support, it's overall. They are not homogeneous. We can speak about 45% who supporting without qualms, do not challenge the decision of the government, but only I think 15% can be described as a hawkish supporters of this war, this military operation. And well, this didn't change much. What changed very soon and very rapidly, that this understanding that it will take much longer than people expected at the very beginning. And as time passed, we saw that now more than half of the population are saying that it will take half of the year or longer. And this is what people were understanding about this war, that it will be hard, it will be long, but many people still hoped to avoid any involvement into it. And this may change this attitude, but I think it will take time. It will not be collapse of the ratings, collapse of the support, but it will make people question once again what is happening and how to relate to it.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much. Denis Volkov from Levada Center, he's a sociologist. We've been talking about the level of support of this mobilization in Russian society.
Russia tomorrow.
The mobilization announced by Putin promises unexpected consequences for him within the country. As a result of repression, people have been afraid to go out and protest. But what happens if they will be sent to the front and likely die otherwise? Since the beginning of the war, Putin has strangled the country with fear. But what is stronger, the fear of repression or the fear of death in a senseless war? Now already in Moscow and other cities, people are coming out to protest. Here's a video from the capital. People are chanting "No to war." Vladimir Putin has found himself in a difficult situation that he's never found himself in before. For more on this, my colleague, Dosh columnist Mikhail Fishman.
In March, after Russian blitzkrieg in Ukraine had failed and Russian troops had withdrawn from near Kyiv, it was not yet game over for Putin and his inner circle. After all, Russia's military was still much more powerful than Ukraine's, and the victory still looked certain. The military would regroup, modify its tactics, and Ukraine would inevitably succumb to the pressure. In April, Russia concentrated its military effort in Donbass, leveling towns and villages to the ground with barrage fire, slowly advancing with big losses in personnel and resources, but capturing new territory in the eastern part of Ukraine. By the end of May, early June, the Kremlin was celebrating again. Sooner or later, this or next year, Kyiv would fall. Military experts, although they didn't project their expectations that far, were still cautious. Russia's advance was evident, and the idea that Ukraine would lose the war still sounded probable. But now, Russia's latest defeat near Kharkov is different. For Vladimir Putin, it is a strategic failure, militarily, psychologically, and politically. Militarily, it has demonstrated that in its current state, Russian military is unable to win this war. And importantly, Putin now knows that he cannot trust his own generals. Russian military knows how to destroy cities with heavy artillery, but can't cope with simple tasks of military planning. It's a vicious circle. Putin sees that his army is fighting poorly, so he interferes, destroying the command hierarchy, which is so important on the battlefield. And it gets even worse. In the spring, Russian military operated as a single mechanism. Now it is an array of various disparate groups. Military analyst Yan Matveyev lists them as follows.
Here are the groupings: the regular army of the Russian Federation, the separatist militias of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, PMC Wagner, the National Guard, and the Kadyrovtsi.
They are controlled differently, supplied differently, engage in combat differently, they are not coordinated, and this, among other things, is a huge reason for latest defeat. Yevgeny Prigozhin does not report to the Minister of Defense. He has direct access to Putin, and army leadership repeatedly proves its incompetence. As the independent publication Important Stories wrote recently, the Ministry of Defense is trying to convince Putin to begin mass mobilization through newspaper articles, not in person, because before, Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu promised Putin that there would be no mobilization. And Prigozhin, a former criminal who did time in the 80s, is now the face of this senseless and bloody war. He is gathering prisoners to join his paramilitary Wagner group. He tells the prisoners loudly and clearly that they will be stormtroopers. On the battlefield, their first sin is desertion, the second, alcohol and drugs, and the third, marauding and plundering.
You'll go home with a pardon in 6 months. Those of you who want to stay with us can stay behind, but there are no other options to go back. For anyone who comes in on the first day and thinks to themselves, what have I gotten myself into? You'll be marked as a deserter, and the firing squad will follow soon after. Any questions, guys? After the questions, everyone get in line for an interview. You have 5 minutes to decide.
In this movie, Prigozhin is the director and the lead character, and we, the audience, find ourselves inside a Hollywood dystopia featuring class-divided society after a nuclear winter where rich, greedy capitalist autocrats arrange gladiator fights for their amusement. Prigozhin stands out in the sea of helplessness and impotence demonstrated by the state. Putin and state propaganda are lost. On television, through common screams about Nazis in Ukraine, new questions are quietly whispered. Maybe something is going wrong after all. But the general party line prevails. Victory will be ours. There is no other option. It's us or them. Overall, in these confusing and uncertain days, propaganda has been dominated by the clear message: it is okay to shell civilian infrastructure.
Ходит информация, что наши нанесли грамотный удар. Теперь река Ингулец не обмелевшая, а теперь это мощные водные приправы, которые смывают временно наведенные приправы, которые пытались поставить украинская армия. То есть, видите, вы услышали, не то, что я говорил, жестче надо, жестче.
Мы начинали специальную военную операцию против украинских нацистов. И поэтому действовали крайне осторожно, очень аккуратно, стремясь нанести минимальный ущерб гражданам, которые не участвуют в нацистских батальонах. Сейчас, когда реально 100% мы видим, что с нами воюет НАТО, естественно, что арсенал средств воздействия с нашей стороны должен расширяться.
Хотелось бы просто прояснить понятие, вот мы наносим удары по критической гражданской инфраструктуре. В период ведения боевых действий нет такого понятия, как гражданская инфраструктура.
Meanwhile, Putin consistently downplays his goals in this war. In Samarkand, he says, don't get confused. The goals of the special military operation is the liberation of Donbass, and this operation proceeds as planned.
Несмотря на вот эти попытки контрнаступления украинской армии, у нас наступательные операции на самом Донбассе-то не прекращаются, они идут.
That is to say, well, if we were squeezed out from near Kharkov, that was not our battle. Neither does it matter what's going on in the south. It's not where we... After latest retreat, the occupation of Donbass becomes nearly impossible. Secondly, what should collaborators in the occupied territories think? That they will be left behind without a second thought? This is a very important issue during the war. Thirdly, what should the military be thinking? For example, in the south, at the right bank of the Dnipro River. What are they doing there? What are they dying for? Yet Putin's words reflect reality. Stretched across hundreds of miles of battlefront, Russian military lacks the troops to hold the lines, and it is likely it will lose more territory soon. Psychologically, the myth of the world's second army was Putin's essential source of prestige and might both across post-Soviet territory and on the global stage. NATO generals were praising Russia's military modernized skills and power. This is how Putin's army looked on the pages of the New York Times just before the war.
A significantly upgraded military has emerged as a key tool of Vladimir Putin's foreign policy, as he flexes his might around the globe and most ominously on the Ukrainian border. Under Mr. Putin's leadership, military analysts have said that it has been overhauled into a modern, sophisticated army, able to deploy quickly and with lethal effect in conventional conflicts.
Now, the myth of the world's second army has collapsed, and the world knows. the Putin's military is as disorganized and unprepared for modern warfare as before. Now, after years of heavily investing in his image of the world's most powerful strongman, Putin looks weak. Since the beginning of the war, Russia has consistently lost influence in post-Soviet territories. Countries that used to depend on Moscow are now looking for other centers of gravity, namely China and Turkey. And Putin is forced to explain himself to China's and even to India's leader, now without that familiar expression of iron confidence on his face.
Высоко оцениваю сбалансированную позицию китайских друзей в связи с украинским кризисом. Понимаем ваши вопросы, ваши точности на этот счет.
Я знаю вашу позицию по конфликту в Украине, и ваши озабоченности, которые вы постоянно высказываете.
Thirdly and finally, Putin has suffered a political defeat because he has no good options left. He has nothing with what to counter the offensive of Ukraine. Mass mobilization is impossible. Propaganda rejects any hint of it from the outset. This is a clear case.
Впереди очень серьезные и важные решения, и эти решения должны быть восприняты нашим народом, нашей страной, потому что никакого выбора, кроме победы, у нас нет. Вот, собственно, и все.
Но вы народонаселение раньше времени не запугиваете.
Mobilization is impossible because it is completely at odds to how Putin has built his relationship with the nation. For decades, he shepherded Russian people, and successfully, into a state of apathy and lack of will. It was in Stalin's time that the leadership gathered the people into a single fist. Putin's power, on the other hand, has always been based on social depolitization and demobilization. For the nation, all Putin's wars were virtual. They were based on vanity, not death and sacrifice. As the sociologist Boris Dubin wrote, in Putin's Russia, a new tool of dominating over society is the disunity of the masses, new in comparison with the totalitarian Soviet approach. In Putin's Russia, the state does not shape the nation with strength and power, but relies on its weakness. Putin knows that involving people in the matters of state is the beginning of his own end. He can't allow this. A few days after the defeat near Kharkov, it seems like propaganda has finally found its main message. No matter how difficult it is, we can't back off.
Если мы дадим заднюю никто не даст больше, кроме нас. Если мы не дадим заднюю, они могут дать заднюю. А вот если мы ее дадим, они ее не дадут.
Okay, but what does this mean in practice? These words have no real meaning. It's just empty talk, a bluff. Propaganda lingers and waits for Putin to make his next move. And Putin is lingering too. He has always been cautious, but now he has made his fatal error. He fell into the trap of dictatorship. He has become too greedy for flattery. He started to believe that the image of his power and might that he had been projecting outwards for the last 20 years reflects reality. The virtual war with the global world on which his authority rested, he transformed into a real one. And now he is losing. He has used his trump card, the military, to no avail. He has another trump card left. Propaganda cries out that in such a war there are no bad means. We need victory, no matter how and at what cost.
Мы должны победить, притом победить так, чтобы никого не было иллюзий. Поэтому почему говорю? Если для этого надо использовать любые типы оружия, их надо использовать. Потому что в любом другом случае нашу страну будут ноги вытирать.
But again, it's just empty talk, lingering. What last 6 months of this war have demonstrated is that Putin is not ready for nuclear escalation. In Washington, options for a response to a tactical nuclear strike are already on the table. The most evident of them is NATO troops entering the war, boots on the ground. And Putin understands. This is too dangerous, leads to consequences he can't control. He is already losing the war with Ukraine. How could he possibly hope to win the Third World War?
I wonder, Mr. President, what you would say to him if he is considering using chemical or tactical nuclear weapons.
Don't. It will change the face of war unlike anything since World War II.
And now Mikhail joins me here. Mikhail, thanks for joining me. I will quote two phrases from what we've just seen. He knows that he's in a difficult position and he keeps losing the criminal war. What do you think? Could the decision to mobilize help him recover?
That's a great question. Yes, hi Tikhon, and thank you for having me. Yes, we understand from past 2 weeks that Putin would like to end this war already, but in a way that would at least let him show something as a victory to justify somehow these catastrophic casualties that his military had suffered during last 6 months. But Kyiv would never agree to something like this, and he is in a difficult position. So he has two cards on the table, both that he can't really play. The one is mass mobilization, the other is going nuclear, and he's sort of trying to use them both, but partially, yes, but not to the very end, not going to the very end, which with each one of them. So he's raising the stakes, he's upping the ante, but at the same time he's pushing himself into a corner. Nobody knows how, well, at least at the moment, how the mobilization would go. And he needs them basically on the battlefield because he needs them to hold the lines, to make the troops hold the lines across the whole length of the front, which is what, about 1,000 miles or something like that. And we don't know to what extent this mobilization would work. Will they be able to actually get to combat these 300,000 new conscripts? That's not known, and what would be their motivation, what would be their morale, what would be their skills when it will happen, and most importantly, we don't know what will Ukrainian military do before it all happens, and how fast and how far would it advance on the battlefield to the east. This is very, very important question as well.
The other question which I have, and I hear a lot of such questions these days, is the possible reaction of the Russian society. We heard a lot that the decision of mobilization was not really popular in the country, and we saw that even despite repression, people in Russia took to the streets to protest. Maybe there are only a few protests, but still, there have been no protests whatsoever for 6 months. What do you think? Does this movement has potential? And the second question is, will the decision to mobilize create disagreement in the Russian leadership or maybe in Putin's entourage?
I think that Putin understands clearly that mobilization works totally against his interest. He knows that, and that's what I was telling in my take actually, that his power, his authority across Russian nation is built upon demobilization of the nation, not mobilization of it. So he, of course, is afraid of mobilizing society. Military mobilization equals basically social mobilization. What is the difference? And of course he understands it, and he's afraid of it, and that's why he goes not the full way. He doesn't go the full way. He just he stops short of calling real mass mobilization, but he agreed to limited amount of this mobilization. But he understands that it is very dangerous for him personally as a leader. But what is important, I think, is not that. These protests, of course, are very. They show courage. They demonstrate that in Moscow and other big cities, there are still people who oppose this war, this criminal war, and they are very brave to taking to the streets. This is, of course, what we see at the moment. But what is more important, I think, is that mobilization touches the contract between Putin and the nation, and even if the nation doesn't stand up, doesn't mean that it agrees with what's going on. And the consequences we don't know yet. We know that dissent would start growing. We know that people now understand that they cannot distance themselves from this war. They cannot keep away from it. That this war starts coming to their homes, to their kitchens, to their relatives, to their sons, and it's now part of their life, which they thought was free of real war. The war was supposed to be virtual, as every war that Putin had thought before. And now it's not the case. And this is the very sensitive and difficult and important situation, which does not transform itself momentarily into street protests, but touches something very, very important inside the nation's heart.
Well, let's see how it goes. Thank you so much, Mikhail Fishman, my colleague from TVRain.
Russia tomorrow.
The team of the leader of the Russian opposition, politician Alexei Navalny, invites Russians to protest in a way they can and even to set fire to military commissariats. Navalny himself, who is currently imprisoned, has once again declared the war to be criminal.
Now we understand the main point, that this is a crime, a criminal, aggressive war that's only getting worse and escalating, that Putin is trying to involve as many people as possible into. He wants hundreds of thousands of people in this bloodbath, which will of course lead to great tragedy and a huge number of deaths, and definitely not to anything good. The extent of the crime and the number of those involved only increases, just so only one person can hold on to his personal position of power. To extend his grip on power, Putin is tormenting his neighboring country and killing their people, and now he's sending a huge number of ordinary citizens into this meat grinder. It was a crime before, but now it's even more of an atrocity on a greater scale.
With each passing day, the Kremlin situation becomes more and more difficult on the front in Ukraine and more unpredictable internally within the country. Vladimir Putin had clearly not accounted for this when he ordered the special military operation 6 months ago. This has been Russia Tomorrow. I'm Tikhon Zitko. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, share with your friends, and support us on GoFundMe. The link is in the description. See you soon on TVRain.